from here first, and if my voice doesn't carry sufficiently, I'll get up there where I should be as the grand exponent of whatever we're talking about today, which I guess is what everybody suspects it's about. It's about conspiracies or the absence of them in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Correct?
Yes.
Up louder. Okay. That's why I married her in 1959 when Eisenhower was still got her, and she still puts me right. Okay.
Talk loud.
The Warren Commission, forward. She's my slide switcher. The Warren Commission. There's a new book out, 560 pages. I've read it, every single paragraph. It's excellent. Philip Sheehan, S-H-E-N-O-N, a New York Times reporter, who's taken to writing popular history. He did a history of the 9/11 Commission and its investigation. And it's been very well received. I've seen any reviews of this particular book, but I highly recommend it. It's a real page-turner. It follows in the great tradition of applying scholarship to the Warren Commission, why it was, what it was about, what it did, what it got right, what it got wrong. And what we know today is from an AP poll released just this week. Well, let's see if it conforms to it. How many of you think there was a conspiracy to assassinate John F. Kennedy? Well, the Associated Press did this poll this week. This week, and 85% of the American people think there was a conspiracy. Now, you may not know this. It's amazing how many people don't know it. But there were two full-fledged investigations of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. One was the Warren Commission. Made its report in 1964, in September of '64. At first it was well received, and then the criticism began, mostly because of what was printed in the Warren Commission. Most of the early criticism came by critiquing the report itself that Earl Warren and his colleagues on the Warren Commission, I will name them for you in a minute if you don't know them. The only one that you probably most famous is Gerald Ford over here on the right, who was a congressman at that point. What we now know that makes him even more famous is that he was a stool pigeon. He was reporting daily to the FBI about what was going on inside the commission. That is fact. That is not speculation. Well, there's more than that. Then after the Warren Commission made its report, at first fairly well received for about 10 minutes, and then the criticism began, books, magazine articles, critiques, things within the Warren Commission report itself that didn't make sense to people. The erosion of its credibility began and probably culminated in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. How many have seen JFK by Oliver Stone? It was on this week. I forget now. I think it was Reels, R-E-E-L-Z, the cable channel Reels. Did anybody see it on? I confess I watched it again. I've seen it before several times. Probably culminated in that, which with an all-star cast of major Hollywood actors working pretty much to scale because they didn't believe the Warren Commission either, was a good way of propagating the conspiracy theory, probably the one that is most widely held to be true today, if one is true. And that's that there was a rogue element within some government agency that was somehow behind the Kennedy assassination. That seems to be the conspiracy theory that has the most staying power today. All right, to back up a little bit, I won't slow the slide of Julius Caesar. One of the primary problems the Warren Commission had was that it could not find a motive that was anything other than very general for what Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin they named as the killer, they couldn't find a motive. They came very close without quite actually saying so, that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated John F. Kennedy because his wife had made him sexually jealous. So we're admiring Kennedy's good looks and charisma and pointing out to him that he did not measure up. Now, if every husband whose wife has pointed out his shortcomings went out and assassinated the president, we'd have a lot of dead presidents. I think I have a better one. If you can back it up now, let's show the picture of this graphic. Julius Caesar. I think I know why. 2,000 years later. 2,000 years. And we still know the name of the assassin, don't we? Does anybody here not know his name? Please, everybody should. Brutus. That seems motive enough for not just this assassin, but perhaps all assassins. And there have been 4 in our history. Yes, Guiteau was assassinated, Garfield, Shelgauche assassinated McKinley. But there have been others besides, and of course most famously John Wilkes Booth, assassin of Lincoln. And their names are forever linked historically with the person they killed. And so to some extent, if you care about living in history, I suppose that could be a motive. But then again, they aren't the only ones. There have been several failed assassins in our history. Andrew Jackson was the first. And his potential assassin, forgive me, I am elderly and I can't think of his name. He didn't succeed in killing Jackson. He didn't get off a shot, but he was adjudged mentally insane and assigned to an insane asylum, which maybe that's a characteristic of all of them, to some degree. Well, what I'm saying is forward now, is that the motive was an issue, and what we need to know is why there was so much attention focused on this one. Also this week, I have here a report of the Kennedy family's current views on who killed their famous kinsman. Almost everybody think it was a rogue agency within the government. We do know now, although Robert F. Kennedy, who was Attorney General and would have been in an ideal position to prosecute any assassins, never said one public word of criticism about the Warren Commission. We do know from believable people who knew him well and were close friends that he said the first thought he had, in fact the first thing he did, was to get in touch with the head of the CIA and said, I want you to tell me, did the CIA assassinate my brother? And I think Richard Helms, who was really the man in charge at that point, said, no, we didn't. In point of fact, that's what those people are hung up on, is the fact that there was a rogue agency within the government. Is there even any proof of such instruments existing? Were there any rogue elements? Well, my word, we have all sorts of examples. Not the most recent, is the whole Watergate affair, where rogue elements within the government were indeed trying to cover up a crime, the bugging of the Democratic National Headquarters. Then there was, of course, the most famous case, and that was in Iran-Contra, when a rogue element within the CIA and the National Security Council went to great lengths to try to cover up the fact that they were trading arms with Iran and then shipping the funds to the Contras in Central America in a war they supported, but which had been forbidden by Congress. The name Fawn Hall ring a bell for any lascivious old men in the crowd. Simply stunningly gorgeous blonde woman who worked in the National Security Council, who was personal secretary to Oliver North. Does that name ring a bell? And she famously smuggled incriminating documents out of the offices of the National Security Council. How? Someone should know this. This should be in our culture of celebrity.
In her purse.
In her underwear, she smuggled the incriminating documents. And then she subsequently turned down a $1 million offer from that great American Larry Flynn, publisher of Hustler magazine, to pose nude for his magazine. Hugh Hefner also got in touch and wanted likewise to pose her nude, but she would not do it. I don't know what's become of Fawn Hall, but she didn't take the money that I know of anyway. Okay, well, so we do have instances which these things do exist and they do happen. And so it's not altogether unexpected that 85% of us would think there was some sort of a conspiracy. Now, what that conspiracy was varies according to time and place, and so forth. I should say this: every single act of personal violence carried out against a public figure in our history, similar conspiracy theories have been hashed to explain what is almost the unexplainable. Every single one. the White House gardener was in love with Mrs. Lincoln, and she conspired with John Wilkes Booth. They get crazier and crazier. There were certain people who've been arguing from time to time that Kennedy had himself killed. Well, because he was sick, was going to die, and he wanted to die heroically. They got to hammer on all those Wagnerian scales, you see. And of course, if that was his goal, he would have achieved it. Because, like Lincoln, who never had to face all the problems of solving the post-Civil War era and its political problems, the greatest single failure in our history, which was Reconstruction, failed to solve the festering wounds and problems of slavery and race in our society, with which we are still dealing. He didn't have to face it. Now, he was surely much more adept as a leader than Andrew Johnson, who was impeached for his troubles. But still, would his reputation as our greatest president be what it is today if he had not died at the moment of victory and did not have to face all those problems of the post-Civil War Reconstruction, which, as I say, resulted in what is arguably the greatest single problem or failure in our national history, the failure to resolve the racial aspects of the Civil War. We simply put them off for a century, replacing slavery with neo-slavery and segregation. And the issues still remain. Well, what about John F. Kennedy? What did his presidency actually accomplish? Yet he's regarded by most Americans who fill out these presidential polls, and even a good many professional historians, as one of the great presidents. And yet there's very little in his administration of 1,000 Days, which, by the way, is still a pretty good book by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I recommend it. Even though it was somewhat hagiographic and that Schlesinger was an admirer of Kennedy and his prose shows it, still it's okay. You can read that too. There are all sorts of things out there you can read. I know that because I just got another story came out this week. There have been 40,000 titles published on the life of John F. Kennedy. So start today. This, I say, a cruel and shocking act, a secret history of the Warren Commission, the Kennedy assassination, which really deals greatly with what faults the Warren Commission had. And it did have some. There's no question about that. Now, did they get it entirely wrong? That's another question. And there you need to read another book. There are two books I recommend that you read. I'm sorry, I'm being very professorial here. If you want just a pure conspiracy theory, you have your choice. There are many, many of them. Start by watching the movie JFK, and then go on to Anthony Summers' Conspiracy, a British writer, popular nonfiction, who did a pretty good book. I used to use it in my course on this subject. And then, if you want to get the counter, say, you can read Richard Posner's Gerald Posner. There are two Posners, one Richard and one Gerald. They're very different people. Gerald Posner's Case Closed, which is a full-throated defense of the Warren Commission. Students in my class read both, and they can make up their own minds. I might add that the conspiracy theorists decreased in number as the course went on. You see the many sides of the issue. Remember Vincent Bugliosi? Vincent Bugliosi. Does that name ring a bell for anybody? Yeah.
DA Los Angeles.
That's right, and the man who prosecuted the Manson killers. And he wrote a book called Reclaiming History, which is another and more recent full-throated defense of the Warren Commission, pointing out something, that most of the criticisms of the Warren Commission dwell on people who said things. And he looks into the background of people who spoke and said, I saw a gunman on the grassy canal, or knoll, as it's called. And he does a good job of these people who spoke thus of seeing gunmen on the grassy knoll have a fair incidence of mental illness among them. Well, anyway, so there are so many things you can read. Like I say, there are 40,000 titles. You should start early. I must have bought at least 1,000 titles myself. In fact, only recently, I don't fall off the stage here, we sprung. I've got a cardboard box full of tabloid blurbs. This is the most recent, next to most recent Inquirer. Guess what it's got? Lee Harvey Oswald's widow, her secret new life. Lee Harvey Oswald's widow. You can fill up many cardboard boxes in your basement with stuff such as this. Now, don't trust anything that the national, what's the other one? Not Inquirer, the one that's always finding Hitler still living in Andean Village.
The Globe.
Hmm?
The Globe.
The Globe, or yeah. I mean, they just never give up. They're always, they're going to be finding Hitler when he's 110. They'll be finding Kennedy living in the same village in South America, which will only be 4 years from now. All right, well, let's start then with tonight's little exercise in trivia with who these people were on the Warren Commission, shall we? I think you can see one thing wrong with the Warren Commission real quick, can you? They're all white males.
Oh, wow.
This is a different era, though. They're all national figures, all eminently famous. The one on the far left over here is Allen W. Dulles. Who was he?
CIA.
Yes, head of the CIA, first director of the CIA when it was created, and what? He was, yes, he was actually Truman.
Truman?
Yeah, and he served all during the Eisenhower. Who was his brother?
John Foster.
John Foster, Secretary of State during most of the Eisenhower administration. What's he most famous for today? Well, he's actually, no, that's Allen, that's John Foster. Allen is most famous for being in charge of the CIA and being the mastermind behind what set of events. I'm sorry, I'm being very professorial here. I shouldn't do that. I've been a professor in 10 years. I've been retired now for 10 years. He was the one behind the so-called assassination plots against Castro. And he was the one who brought what American institutional entity into the picture on the assassination attempts against Castro. All together now, organized crime. Yes, the CIA contracted out the hit on Castro to organize crime. Really, it did. There's no question about it.
It's crazy.
Did everybody know about it? Well, everybody who needed to know, but they did this. So he knew there were assassination plots against Castro. Now, he's on the commission to investigate the assassination of John F. Kennedy, appointed by Lyndon Johnson. He was the man behind these assassination plots. The person who ultimately is seen by the commission as the assassin is Lee Harvey Oswald, and what about his background vis-a-vis Cuba?
Fair play.
Well, actually, he was riddled. His whole background was riddled with Cuban connections, some trivial, some not so. The most famous last example of it in his life was going to Mexico before he assassinated, only less than 2 months before he assassinated Kennedy, going to Mexico, going both to Cuban and the Soviet embassies, trying to get admitted to Cuba on a visa, which they would not give him. More of that later. But first of all sorts of things having to do with Cuba and the assassination plots against Fidel Castro. What did he tell his fellow commissioners about that? Nothing. He didn't say word one. Did Gerald Ford ever tell his fellow commissioners that he was reporting everything that went on in that commission to the FBI daily? Almost. He did not. Who are these other? Hale Boggs, congressman from Louisiana. John Sherman Cooper, the man next to him. John Sherman Cooper was a senator, a Republican senator from Kentucky. Nicely balanced between Democrats and Republicans. Earl Warren, a Republican from California, former presidential vice candidate, most famous Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, I guess, except John Marshall. Then on his left, your right, the bald gentleman. I like bald guys, I always have. Our first date, when I said I was going to get bald, she was right. She has very perceptive people. She might. Richard Russell, the most powerful senators in the United States Senate, Democrat, if you can call him that. And then John McCloy, next to him between Ford and Russell. Who was he? We've all forgotten today. I like that lady's question. Who was John J. McCloy? International banker, Wall Street titan. He was the king of Germany after World War II. U.S. High Commissioner for Germany. So And then there's Gerald Ford, who was chosen because he was a Republican, one of the few sane Republicans, I guess. You could find a good person to sit there and hold the place. The point is, these are power brokers, the lot of them. There are no angry professors, no radical women, there's certainly no blacks. So it is, if there were secrets to be kept, these are the guys who would know how to keep them. So much of the early criticism of the Warren Commission comes from just this factor. Although in that era we were accustomed to these kinds of people, we still hadn't learned to distrust our government. That will come later, with much pain. Much later. But fairly rapidly, in the 1960s, Vietnam, Watergate, the famous Church Committee. What was the Church Committee? Anybody know? Frank Church, Democratic senator from, I think, Idaho.
Is it Idaho or Utah?
Idaho, I think it was Utah. Pretty sure it's Idaho. Executive action, what was that?
The movie.
Hmm?
The movie.
Yes, what was that movie about? It was one of the first movies to criticize the Warren Commission, executive action. It was a phrase used to describe a particular department within the CIA dedicated to assassinating foreign leaders, of which we did a number. Patrice Lumumba, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and of course that was what was behind the attempted assassination plots against Fidel Castro. So that's where we begin to get, and this is all after Watergate. This is the mid-70s when the Church Committee, there were two committees of Congress, began to get really, really worried about intelligence agencies becoming rogue within their own government. One was called the Church Committee in the Senate, and the other one was in the House of Representatives called the Pike Committee. Well, these are the things then that cause for most people, faith in the Warren Commission's judgment and its investigation and its honesty to begin to erode. And in a sense, that's what this book is really about. This gentleman was able to get in touch with nearly all of the surviving staffers who worked at the lower levels of the Warren Commission, because many of them are still alive, although perhaps the most famous staffer of the Warren Commission, the one and who's the author of the so-called single bullet theory, which is probably the single most discredited aspect of the Warren Commission, or at least publicly discredited. This particular gentleman was Arlen Specter, also later a senator from Pennsylvania. But the point here is that this all builds up to this point to cast doubt backward toward the Warren Commission and its probity and its judgment because of what more recent historical events were showing us. Iran-Contra, Watergate, the Gulf of Tonkin, where CIA staged raids on North Vietnamese islands, and the very next night sent a couple of destroyers in there. The North Vietnamese would think were part of this raiding party, and it became the basis for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which was our declaration of war in Vietnam. Now, there was a blueprint for that during the Cuban crisis. They had set up plans, don't do very well in this, to set up shoot-downs of American planes, sacrificing American lives, and the shooting of a ship that they could blame on the Cubans as a cause of war. And so we know that this kind of planning was going on. So that's why so many people today, including Robert Kennedy, think that if this were a conspiracy to assassinate, it would have been carried out only by a rogue element within the U.S. government. Okay, now are we ready to go forward at this point? This explains, I hope, the erosion of confidence. What's this about? We're in the GAR hall. Those are the officers on the court-martial that tried the Lincoln conspirators after the Civil War. General Lew Wallace was the chairman of that court-martial commission. So we have a history when traumatic events like this happen of investigating it. It's what we did after Lincoln's assassination. This was an official investigating body that looked in and hanged 4 people, sentenced 9 others to prison terms for their involvement in the Lincoln conspiracy. Forward. That's the famous sole photo of Lincoln's corpse. By the way, history is important. It's really important politically. The Kennedy family, Jackie too, had their eye on Lincoln after John Kennedy was killed, even with all the trauma that enveloped that family after he was shot and killed in Dallas. They wanted to bury John F. Kennedy like Lincoln had been buried. Forward. Because of the connection they could see building between Lincoln and Kennedy, and they were correct. It was right. There is this connection between them because they are usually rated 1 and 2 as the greatest presidents in most popular polls. Even many trained historians agree. Forward. There's Lincoln, of course. The little boy, little girl, you ever seen this? That's Elaine 30, 40 years ago. Those little girl, little boy sitting down here in front. That was a 1970 Chevy Vega. Perhaps the worst automobile ever built. I think after 1 year, I think it was still being held together most of by congealed rust. I wonder why General Motors went bankrupt and had to be saved by the government. Well, they had some idea that Lincoln's glory or glamour, because of his life, his achievements, and the trauma of his leaving of this life contributed greatly to the Lincoln legend. And they had this idea, they wanted to bury John Kennedy like Lincoln had been buried forward. But they didn't realize, of course, that funeral customs had changed enormously in a century that passed. And you're not about to traipse a corpse across the United States for 12 days en route to being buried in Springfield, Illinois, where that tomb is. Things have changed in the culture. Didn't matter. Kennedy did somehow inherit the glamour of the death, his death, and the manner and timing and the meaning of it was linked to Lincoln. Forward. This is almost a good subject for a lecture itself. Lincoln and the Dead March, showing how much culture had changed. Maybe 1 million people saw Lincoln's corpse. Maybe 1 million. No one knows for sure. But they had a hard time keeping it because he was shot. He lived a long time after he'd been shot, not a long time, a few hours. Enough for it to be very hard for the embalmer's art to do much disguising of the trauma that had taken his life. And so there are still memoirs of people whose children who were held up to see Lincoln's corpse, and it was a gruesome and horrifying sight. At least the family had enough sense not to try to exhibit Kennedy's corpse in open casket. They couldn't do this. Where are you going? Now this is where the trouble came for the Warren Commission. That's it, 26 volumes of evidence. They're not hiding anything, but one way to hide things, somebody once said, is to put too much out there.
Right.
And no way, there is no index, no table of contents, no much of anything. Just here it is, have at it. And they didn't think anybody would buy it. Instead, it went through multiple printings. People bought these 26 volumes of evidence from the government printing office, and in fact, it was really a bargain. And the one report they thought everybody would read, and that's what most people have read since then, is a very long document. It's the summary report. It's called the summary. How many here have read that? Paul, raise your hand. He took my course at Western. He got to read a couple of chapters, and if he did, if he read it, I don't know. Well, I don't know. He graduated from Western, and I must say, didn't have the prestige of Ginger's graduation place, which was the U of I. But neither one of them is living in our basement. Neither is unemployed, and neither is in jail. So that means did well by our 2 children. Okay, so the 26 volumes, it took a long time to parse through this. And much of the criticism of the Warren Commission has come right out of this document. Now, here's another thing you need to know. This is a lot of raw stuff, but they didn't release anything like everything. Just selected things. And the truth is, there are people saying things to the FBI. And here's another point. The Warren Commission was these old men who really weren't much involved in the process of actually investigating the assassination, were mostly figureheads. And by this point,